All right, I'm going to talk for about an hour and a half about phones. No demonstrations, just talk. Go get a drink. So lately, I've been doing a lot of reading about two topics related to the American telephone industry. The first is ISDN, and the second is the growth of the early internet. And I didn't have a specific focus for this research. I started out writing a script about the technology behind 56K modems, but after a couple days, I decided there's no real meat on that bone. They've been explained by many other people just as well as I could do or better, and ultimately the topic isn't all that interesting except as fodder for bar trivia between ex-telecom workers. I've also been having some tough times with health issues lately, and my focus has been all crocused. So at some point, after giving up on the 56K video, I found myself just browsing Usenet. Now, many of you know what that is, but for those who don't, imagine a gigantic internet forum that was very popular before the web was invented and hung on with nerds and network professionals for several years afterwards. You used to have to pay for access to it, especially to see older posts, but Google made a huge read-only archive available through their Groups product like 20 years ago, and to date, none of their executives have remembered that it exists, so it hasn't been shut down yet. God willing, nobody tells them it's still running because it has archives going back to the early 80s that you can search through instantly. And I can't overstate how useful this is for researching late 20th century technology. Usenet was popular among mostly like CS academics and other high-power nerds. So, a lot of wealthy and connected people who bought every gadget under the sun and worked on big networks and whatnot, they all posted on there. So, yeah, I do a lot of research on Usenet. Let's just pick something for an example. There's a kind of thing called a leased line modem, which I don't know that much about, except that they were mostly relevant before the 90s. I know a little bit about the technical details, but I want to know what people thought of those, because it might help me understand what they were all about. So I went and searched for leased line modem before 1985 and came up with a post from a guy who was thinking of getting one all the way back in 82. Now, I hadn't planned on going into the details on this post. I was just going to show it to you as a quick example, but it was so juicy that I just dropped what I was doing to analyze it. It reads as follows. I'm planning to rent a leased line from Ma Bell to provide 9600 baud service to my home 1 mile away from my VAX. Mother has offered to rent me a 9600 baud modem for $320 a month, times 2 since I need one at both ends. Does anyone know of a cheaper alternative? Please reply to the address above. Signed, David P. Dobkin. Yeah, so this is basically a cipher. It's a string of code words that make no sense in the modern world. So let's decipher it. First, leased lines. We all know what dial-up was, right? You buy a pair of modems, you connect them to a pair of computers and a pair of phone lines, and then you can dial from one modem to the other to connect two computers, even across very long distances. And because you're leveraging the phone company network, you can basically nail up a connection between any two places to have phone service anywhere in the world. Done. Simple. Right. Except that's not the only kind of modem that existed. The sort we're used to is called a switched line modem, and they were definitely the most common type, but going back to the very beginning of modem technology, and I think up to this day, the phone companies also offered something called leased line service. In this scheme, you still connect two computers over modems, but there's no dialing involved. Instead, you went to the phone company, gave them the addresses of two buildings you wanted to connect together, and they would locate phone lines going to those two places and basically just twist the wires together. So you ended up with a big extension cord going between your two locations. This is a gross simplification. The lines were often conditioned in various ways. There might have been filters and echo canceling circuitry and even amplifiers or digitizers, especially if you were going long distances. So while it's fun to imagine that you might be able to stick a 9-volt battery on one end of the wire and see 4 volts appear clear across town at the other end, I don't think that was realistic, but the important thing is that a leased line was a point-to-point connection. The wires you were paying for were notionally phone lines. In another life, they could have been phone lines, but they weren't connected to the phone system, just to your two locations. This is why the more conventional modem is called a switched line type. They only work on phone lines that go into a phone switch. That is, the device owned by a telephone company, or telco, that connects your phone to other phones when you dial a number by literally using switches to connect them together. In the old days, it's more complicated now. Anyway, if you were to connect a phone to a leased line, you wouldn't get any dial tone because you're renting access to the wire, but not to any of the other usual phone stuff. And you might wonder what the point of this actually is. To be honest, I'm still kind of sorting that out myself. I've been reading about these on and off for years, and it still isn't completely clear what all the benefits were, but it's not hard to imagine some. For one thing, a leased line is more secure. If you have some government computer connected to a leased line, nobody can dial into it because there's no phone number attached. So the only person who can possibly access it is the person at the other end, or I guess somebody who physically taps into the line, but you've got guys with guns to prevent that. Also, since the line is permanently connected 24/7, you can nail up a link between two computers and just leave it up 24 hours a day. You can do that over the normal switched phone network, but it's not very practical for a lot of reasons. Also, I think, particularly at this time, that leased line modems were faster than dial-up models, so I'm sure there's lots of other reasons, but just those seem solid enough. So going back to the post, Ma Bell, that was slang for the phone company for decades, although I admit I've never seen anyone call them mother. If you don't get the joke, just remember that in 1982, AT&T still had a near monopoly on American phone service, plus a load of federal regulations that made them a de facto state utility. So a lot of their customers saw them as an overbearing authority that had to be obeyed.
She who must be obeyed.
I should point out, though, that this is not why our poster is thinking of renting his modems, even though once upon a time it would have been. In the earlier days of Bell, up through the late 60s, customers weren't allowed to connect anything of their own to a phone line. AT&T rented all equipment to their subscribers, including phones and modems. But by 82, that had long since changed. A consumer could go buy a modem at Radio Shack and plug it straight into their line if they wanted. But since 9600 baud was, I think, the fastest modem in existence at the time, I'm sure it would have cost a fortune. I mean, hell, even a 1200 baud was around $500. So I'd guess 9600 was like $3,000. And based on some other things I've read, I suspect 9600 baud sets didn't work over switched lines yet, that wouldn't be possible for another few years, which might explain why David was looking at a leased line to begin with. So if the modem was that expensive, it certainly made sense to rent it. But that does beg the question, why do any of this? What could possibly have been so important that it was worth potentially spending over $700 a month to access it remotely? And that brings us to the word VAX. That was a highly successful series of mini computers from Digital Equipment Corporation, sort of the successor to the PDP series, and very popular in business and academia, which is, of course, what we're looking at here. While the author's email address is in the ancient UUCP format, so there's a series of routing steps separated by exclamation points. It's very odd by modern standards, but you can clearly see the word Princeton in there. Sure enough, it turns out David P. Dobkin was a teacher at Princeton who became one of the first professors of computer science once that department was created. So presumably he wanted to continue his research even from home, which is a very reasonable demand from someone who was at the forefront of computer science even before it was recognized as a formal discipline. So now we understand more or less everything we read, but do you see what a rabbit hole this was? Just by throwing a couple words into the search field, I was treated to an incredibly rich vertical slice of past life in the world of computing. And there's tons of other stuff on here. You can find everything from people's opinions on Star Trek The Next Generation, posted before it first aired, to advice on how to get Solaris 2.6 to read DOS partitions. It's all in there, and often much easier to find than in other resources. But what I went to Usenet for the other night was something that I pretty much can't get anywhere else, and that is prices. One of the biggest time sinks that I run into in my research is finding accurate prices for things. It's easier for some stuff. Motherboards, for instance, were heavily advertised by retailers who were struggling to compete in a completely open and very saturated market. So if they ran a discount sale, you better believe they shouted it from the mountaintops. A camcorder, on the other hand, more than likely, that never showed up next to a price tag in any publication. Some wound up in catalog listings, but usually after their heyday, when sellers were trying to clear them out. The higher-end consumer ones, especially when they were new, were frequently listed as call for price. And as for the professional options, well, if you need to ask, you can't afford it. Plus, let's be real, nobody ever paid sticker on a professional camcorder or a mini computer or a crane or anything else not sold in normal retail outlets. Prices for business-oriented products are all negotiable. So if you want to know the actual cost that was paid for something like a Cisco Core network switch in 1996, the only place you can get an answer is from the horse's mouth. Someone who actually bought one in its day from a salesperson and can tell you what they actually paid, or were at least being offered. And for this purpose, Usenet is a godsend. What I was trying to find out that night was how much it costs to get ISDN phone service. Now, I intend to do a much bigger video or several videos about this topic, but for the moment, all you need to know is that ISDN was an attempt to replace all the analog telephone lines in the US, and hopefully the whole world, with much more modern digital ones. In most places, especially the US, this utterly failed. It was fielded here in the early 90s, and by 98, there were at most 90,000 subscribers, while analog phone lines had about 270 million subscribers. So by any metric, this was a disaster of a product, and it's shocking they even tried to sell it. The odd thing, though, is that when you try to find out why this was unsuccessful, it's tough to get hard answers. All anyone seems to give is a summary. They say it cost too much and offered too little, and I've come to those same conclusions, but nobody ever says how much and how little. Nobody will tell me this. In 25 years of periodically hearing about ISDN, no one has ever said how much it actually cost. And I finally realized that I could probably get that answer on Usenet. And I did. But I got a lot more than I bargained for. The first place I stumbled into was a news group called info.inet.access, and this turned out to be a forum for internet service providers, but not for users to discuss them, for dialogue between the people operating them. So probably goes without saying, my jaw dropped about a foot when I realized what I'd found. This is the kind of behind-the-scenes talk that you always wish you could see, and here was a seemingly unlimited supply of it, mostly from the year 2000 and before. This was guaranteed to be terrific stuff, and I was not disappointed. My first hit was a thread with the cryptic title, Adtran Atlas 800 BRI to PRI, and if you think I'm going to explain what every word of that means, buddy, you know me too well. But let's read the post first. I just received some advertising from Adtran about the Atlas 800. It looks like they have some cards that will convert BRIs to a PRI. Is anybody using this? We're not doing 56K yet because we can't get PRI lines, and CT1s are a ripoff here, but we can get BRIs. If this thing really works, it may allow us to offer 56K/ISDN, which would be great. Signed, Lance Julander. So yeah, that's probably pretty impenetrable, but don't worry, I know what it all means. I just so happen to own a related device, the Adtran Atlas 550. Shoutouts to Chris for sending this to me. And it does, in fact, support BRI to PRI conversion because I got it to do exactly what Lance was trying to do. So I know exactly what he's talking about. I'll explain some of it. ISDN, in the most general terms, was a way to deliver telephone lines digitally as bits on a wire instead of wobbling voltages. It was an incredibly well-designed product from several perspectives, and if the analog phone system hadn't had basically all the kinks wrung out by the time it hit the market, people probably would have appreciated it. They didn't, but it is neat to look at in a vacuum. It came in the two flavors that Lance mentioned, BRI, or Basic Rate Interface, and PRI, or Primary Rate Interface. Now, the PRI was pretty much solely for business use. It was actually an updated version of the much older T1, which had been used to deliver phone traffic to businesses for decades, and it could carry 23 phone calls at once over just 4 wires. Since it was digital, it also made interacting with the phone network a lot easier and more flexible, and it obviously saved a lot of money on wiring. But exactly how much money is the question, and I've never had an answer for that because by the time I got into the game, PRIs were rapidly dying. My work in the phone trenches was at a voice over IP provider, and our job was to replace PRIs, so I never dealt with them directly. I just ripped them out. I knew that they were incredibly popular, but nobody ever told me how much they'd been paying for them. Well, as it happens, this thread elucidates on that exact question. There are multiple price quotes, all wildly different. One guy in Nebraska says he's paying $1,000 a month for a PRI, while another in Maine, I believe, says it's only $500, but only after Brooks came to town. Before that, it was $2,000. A footnote. I believe that was Brooks Fiber, one of the many independent prospectors that went around the country burying loads of fiber optic cable in the 80s and 90s. And presumably what they mean is that Brooks was a CLEC who started. Oh gosh, I haven't defined that yet. That's for later. Brooks probably brought a bunch of fiber optic telco trunks into a region that previously had very limited service due to poor infrastructure investment by the phone companies, but I wasn't actually able to prove that, so maybe it's all wrong. In any case, for some reason, the price apparently dropped by 75% in the space of a couple years, so that's how volatile this market was. I also found a quote of $1,300 per month in Tennessee, so it also seems that prices were wildly different depending on where you were. So this more or less answers my question. Going back to the original post though, Lance is running a dial-up ISP, but he can't offer 56K to his customers. You'll remember I mentioned 56K earlier and that there was some mystery about how it worked. Yeah, this ties in. While millions of Americans had 56K dial-up service on perfectly ordinary phone lines, for complicated science reasons, it's only possible if one end of the connection is on ISDN. So while it's true that 97% of Americans never had this service, an enormous number depended on it after a fashion. But Lance here is implying that the only lines he's able to get for his ISP are analog ones. That is to say, completely ordinary phone lines, like you'd plug one of these into, or one of these. Or a lot of these, you know, an Alexander Graham Bell special, okay? A telegraph line with dipping mustards. And this was quite a common approach for mom and pop ISPs in the 90s. The ideal approach for a big ISP was to buy PRIs or T1s to feed their modem banks, since those brought in tons of calls over very small cables. But they also forced you to buy capacity 24 lines at a time. If you were a really small ISP, and there were tons of those in the 90s, that might just be too much investment. So instead, many mom and pops built their service around gear like this. This is a Livingston Portmaster, and it's one of many types of remote access server, or RAS. There were lots of these. You could get a Cisco, or an Ascend, or a 3Com, or a US Robotics, but all of them did the same thing. They put a bunch of modems in one box, you plugged a bunch of plain old phone lines into them, and then your subscribers could dial into those lines to reach your network and get online. But the Portmaster was a bit unusual because the most common version, the Portmaster 2, didn't include the modems. It just had 24 serial ports on the back, and you brought your own. This led to a lot of nightmarish ISP server closets, but they were still very popular for a long time, and I'd guess that's because you could start small with a modem and then add capacity slowly as your subscriber base expanded. And this worked just fine until 56K came along. As I said, one of the modems in the connection has to be ISDN, and usually that's the provider end. So for Lance to offer 56K, he'd need one of these, a Portmaster 3. Notice no serial ports on the back. This has all the modems built in, and it talks to them over ISDN PRI connections. That's the ports down in the corner. It's no joke to say that this is a complete 56K ISP in a box. It's very convenient and affordable. I think I read somewhere that these were about $13,000, which sounds like a lot, but that's 24 lines of subscriber service, all in a box, ready to go. All you have to do is bring the PRIs. But it seems he couldn't get those wherever he was. Even in 1998, which is an ongoing theme with ISDN, the phone companies developed it. They claimed to want to sell it, but they didn't roll it out anywhere unless they expected guaranteed business, which of course meant that anyone who did want it had a hell of a time getting it, and clearly this was still a problem years into the service's lifetime, since they started rolling it out in like 1990. So even if you were an ISP, you couldn't necessarily pay them for this service. It was a real mess. Now, I'm a little unclear on why Lance was in this situation, because he says he could get a T1. Well, he says CT1, that's short for channelized T1. Don't worry about it. Basically, he's saying that while he can't get PRI, he can get the classic T1 service that PRI was supposed to replace. But what's weird about this is that PRI didn't replace T1. It ran on top of it. You know how an Ethernet cable can carry either IPv4 or V6, even though V6 didn't exist when Ethernet was invented? This is the same situation. PRI was basically a new, heavily updated protocol that ran over the ancient 1960s T1 format and gave it a lot more smarts. So if the telco could bring them a T1, why couldn't they deliver a PRI over it? I don't know. Nobody in the thread ever discusses this fact. Nobody says it's strange, so maybe this was just a thing at the time. It seems strange. I can't think of a justification other than some kind of policy nonsense, and even that's pretty weird because the days of Ma Bell, the faceless and all-powerful corporate overlords, were long over by this point. In 1998, there had been decades of intense regulatory lawmaking, and the phone companies' hands were essentially tied. Discriminatory service limitations were virtually impossible. So if they couldn't prove that delivering this service was technically infeasible without bankrupting themselves, they had to deliver it. So the why here is a bit of a mystery, but the what is obvious. He couldn't get the thing he really needed, but he could get a BRI. Now, BRI was the ISDN product that was intended for small businesses and households. Instead of 23 calls on 4 wires, it delivered 2 calls on just 2 wires. And since existing consumer phone lines all use just 2 wires, it's clear that the plan was for BRI to replace typical analog service without building out any new infrastructure. Imagine that. BRIs were not intended for delivering large numbers of lines to businesses, but, well, Lance was in a pretty tough spot, and there's no technical reason they wouldn't work. A BRI is exactly the same as a PRI. It's like just slicing off 2 channels out of the larger trunk. So if the telco would bring those out to him, he should have been able to use them to provide 56K service. But there's still a problem. BRI and PRI use completely different interfaces. To get his desired 23 call capacity, he'd need to bring in 12 separate BRIs. Actually, he'd get 24 calls at that point, but whatever. Anyway, there's no way to plug BRIs into a Portmaster or pretty much any other 56K head end, so his question is whether it's possible to run all the BRIs into the Adtran Atlas to combine them into a PRI. Well, Lance, your boy got you covered. I've tried it. It works. Question answered. So yeah, the actual request is resolved very quickly, but it spurs a conversation. Jim Logan from Omaha, Nebraska says that he wants to know the answer too because the cost of BRIs per channel is lower where he is. In fact, it's way lower. He does the math and determines that while a PRI costs about $1,000 in his neck of the woods, 12 BRIs at only $39.95 a month is only $480. So there it is, the rest of the answer to my original question. How much did ISDN service cost? In 1998, it was $40 a month. I found a number of other threads that confirmed this. They also point out that it included a bunch of absurd install fees and limitations, but I was just looking for the monthly rate, and this seems to have been it at this point in time. So if you were curious, now you know. Now, obviously, in the places that had the cheaper PRIs, like the $500 ones in Maine, you'd only be saving $20 a month. It's hardly worth the effort, but where Jim is, it's a $520 savings, and absolutely worth it. However, he muses that if you actually tried this, you'd probably end up in a very silly situation because there's almost no chance the telco would actually bring you what you'd ordered. You see, delivering 12 BRIs would require bringing 12 phone lines up to ISDN standards, probably at significant cost. It would also require 12 separate ports at the phone company end, and with ISDN being so poorly deployed, ports were precious. So much more likely they would have simply brought him a PRI. Like, I know I just got done saying that he couldn't get them, but that's probably not for lack of technical ability. It's just that they had some logistical snafu, not enough line cards allocated to that central office or whatever. The point is, I'm sure that they could. The phone company could do anything, especially back then. So between the option of dragging 12 separate lines out to him or installing an upgrade card in the office so they could deliver just one, they'd probably opt to make the upgrade since it would probably save a bunch of money and hassle in the long run. But since the formal order would be for 12 separate lines, that's what they had to deliver. So even if they did bring out a full fat PRI, they'd probably put a box in front of it to convert it into 12 BRIs and then hand those over to Lance, who would then run them into his own box to glue them back together into a PRI. Every phone person I've spoken to agrees that this is definitely how it would have gone down. And it would be an absurd situation, but it's probably because this was all the result of a financial fiction. I doubt that BRIs were actually cheaper to deliver per channel. I mean, hell, I suspect they cost more. But insofar as the phone company actually wanted to sell them, which we're not really sure about, their target market was consumers who barely wanted this service, if at all, so they were pricing them at or below cost to try to drive sales. But FCC mandates required the phone companies to set their prices publicly and to honor those rates for all customers. So their hands were tied. For an individual, for a business, didn't matter. They'd promised $39.95 a month, so unless they could prove it was infeasible to deliver it, Lance probably could have pulled off this scam, no matter how silly it was. Even if the telco lost gobs of money delivering this service, that was their fault for offering a service that they couldn't actually deliver economically. With that said, Jim points out that the scam might not have lasted very long. He figures that once the telco realized what Lance was doing, they'd probably jack up the prices for all BRIs to stop bleeding money. It's already happened here, he says, with dry copper pairs, once they realized we were using those for ADSL. Now, this statement is incredibly funny to me for reasons that are probably obvious to no one. What he's talking about here is another regulatory cheat, a loophole, and I don't need to explain all the background behind it, but that's what we're here for, so I'm gonna. Up until 1996, there were generally only about 8 phone companies in the United States, all known as RBOCs. No, not him. Regional Bell Operating Companies. At one time, those had all been part of one business, AT&T, but when the FCC brought the hammer down in an antitrust case in the late 70s, AT&T chose to spin off all the regional departments into their own entities, known as RBOCs, or the Baby Bells. This situation remained mostly unchanged, with just the RBOCs and a couple independent providers who popped up in the 80s, I think, until 1996, when the US government passed the Telecom Act of 1996. This law was specifically designed to create a Cambrian explosion of new phone carriers, and it did so immediately. The act, as I'll be calling it, was an incredibly draconian piece of legislature. If the FCC's consent decrees in previous decades had crushed AT&T in an iron grip, the Telecom Act put the RBOCs in an iron maiden. First, they were required to allow any company to connect to their network and use its resources at rates determined by their actual operating cost and reviewed and approved by state public utilities commissions and the FCC. In other words, Bell Atlantic, who I think was operating in like New York, couldn't freeze out a potential competitor by charging them $1 a minute to accept local calls, or rejecting them entirely. They had to allow interconnects, they had to charge everyone the same rates, and they had to pay other carriers fair amounts for sending them calls. This will come up later. But the other major portion of the act, and perhaps the more totalitarian one, good meaning, was the local loop unbundling provision. Consider that by 1996, the Baby Bells had spent over a century assembling a pool of unnatural resources that no competitor could ever imagine replicating, and most of it was wires. AT&T had started burying and hanging telephone wire in 1878 and never stopped, eventually installing massive cable trunks and fiber optics throughout the nation, so any potential competitor would have to catch up with over 100 years of trenching work in order to offer service to any significant customer base. Local loop unbundling leveled the playing field by forcing the Bells to allow their competitors to use their wiring, among other things. You see, at one end, all these wires connected to subscribers, but at the other, they connect to the phone company, and this is done through central offices, or COs. Most of these are squat little buildings designed to not be noticed, but they're packed full of switching gear and fed with thousands of wires leading to every structure in the surrounding few miles. Inside COs, you have a bunch of switching equipment, usually referred to as phone switches, that connect local calls directly together, and then for any call that needs to go some distance, sends it off to a tandem office, a separate facility which deals with routing calls between COs. By 96, the Bells had built something like 25,000 of these offices, and for anyone to compete with them meaningfully, they couldn't be forced to redo all that construction work and buy the land, get the easements, and all of that. They needed access to the COs so they could interconnect with the phone company network, and so they could connect to their outside wiring going to potential customers. So the act forced the Bells to let competitors put equipment in their facilities, quartering troops in their home, as it were. This probably already goes without saying, but just to be clear, if one were to sit down in a room and say, I'm not leaving until I come up with a law that causes the most chaos and the most unforeseen consequences, you might just walk out carrying the Telecom Act of 1996. While I support the act, I think it was the right call, it also produced a galaxy of side effects, and it is not an exaggeration to say that we are still feeling the ripples. The incredibly complex legal, physical, and logistical shuffle required to grant third parties access to the dense and delicate infrastructure of the phone network is so complicated that I could do 3 videos on just that topic alone. But for the purposes of our story, or stories, what you should know is that the biggest ripples happened in the late 90s and very early 2000s during the internet's meteoric rise to ubiquity. To put it bluntly, the telephone network was a completely inappropriate way to deliver internet access, but because it was already in place, it's the army we went to war with, and the effects were grim. At first, it was a simple matter of overloading the network to its breaking point with traffic it was never intended for. Let me explain. The internet is packet switched, and you probably know what this means in at least some form, but just to summarize, when you connect to a server in New York from San Francisco, you don't have a true connection. It's all virtual. You send a packet to your ISP addressed to the server at the far end. Their routers identify a connection that will send that packet further east, but not all the way. So it goes down a fiber trunk, and when it gets to its next hop, it gets picked up by another router, which looks at the address and finds another route that goes even further east, and this repeats until it arrives at its destination. Now, all this is possible because that packet is a small chunk of data, often just a few kilobytes, inside what's called a datagram. Yes, I know crappy network education tells you that datagrams are a UDP thing, but that's not true. IP packets and Ethernet frames are also types of datagram. Deal with it. Simply put, a datagram is an envelope with a letter inside. The letter is your data, called the payload, and the envelope is a set of headers identifying at a minimum where the datagram is going and where it came from. That information alone is adequate for a web of routing devices to figure out how to get the packet where it's going, even if each node has no idea where it's been before. So once your packet arrives at the server, it has to read the return address to figure out where to send back a response. And it does. It sends back an acknowledgement. That contains a unique number. Your packet also contained a unique number. Together, these identify a virtual session. And now that you've both heard from each other, you agree that you are now connected, but you aren't, not in any real persistent way. Every single time one of you sends a packet, it starts the process from the beginning. Your local router has to find a path, and the next router has to find another. And that path might change radically for every single packet that you send during a file download. This grants the internet a large degree of redundancy and flexibility, but the telephone network does not work like this. It's fundamentally a circuit-switched design, and it's been that way since the 19th century because it originally was literally a bunch of switched circuits. In the analog era of the phone network, so to a large degree well up into the late 70s, placing a phone call to someone actually connected your phones together. It was almost the same as just stretching an enormous extension cord between your houses, but that cord was made up of many smaller cords. If you made a long-distance call from the west to east coast, your local CO looked at the number and knew it couldn't be connected locally, so it sent it to a tandem office. The tandem then looked for an open route heading east and sent it down the pipe. The next tandem office then found another route to send it further east and so on until it got to the destination office, which connected it to the destination subscriber. This all sounds just like internet routing, except that here you are establishing a real and potentially physical connection. I mean, well, it was actually literally physical back in, let's say 1950. If you placed a call like that, when the process was complete, you ended up with an actual, literal electrical circuit from end to end. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. There were amplifiers and coils and whatnot, but it really was a series of actual physical connections which had to stay connected for the duration of your call. The moment you hung up, a host of relays strung across the nation all went clunk as they relaxed. And people wondered why it cost $2 a minute to make that call. Now, to be clear, this approach was basically dead and buried in most metro areas, if not most areas, by the end of the 80s. The telcos completely converted their networks to digital solid-state switching, so your phone call got turned into a bunch of digital packets as soon as it hit the CO, and those could be sent over fiber lines and satellite links and everything else to get where they were going, where another device would turn the packets back into analog sounds, but those packets weren't datagrams, so they couldn't be packet switched. Unlike the internet, where every little bit of data has a from and to field, the packets in a phone call contain nothing except audio. because to set up a call, you have to first establish a virtual circuit. When you pick up your phone and dial, the dance now is no different than it was in 1950. All the offices involved in the call have to identify a permanent physical path to carry it. The difference in the digital era is that instead of picking a single physical wire to send a call over, the system goes a little bit further. It picks a logical wire inside of a digital trunk. And sometimes that is an actual copper wire, but it could also be a fiber optic OC3 cable or a satellite link or many other things, and you're picking a virtual connection inside that. But this still isn't like packet switching, because no matter what medium it is, it's divided up logically into time slots where each one represents a virtual wire. Once a time slot is chosen, it's locked in for the duration, and the packets follow the same physical and logical path as long as the call is ongoing. So while a modern phone call doesn't activate a bunch of physical relays like it used to, it does tie up a fixed finite set of resources. Now, this makes sense for normal phone calls because when you dial somebody up, you use the line the whole time you're connected. Your voice is continuously being transmitted and you're continuously hearing the person at the other end. So you have to tie up a whole chain of finite resources the entire time. The same is true on a packet switched network, technically. So the introduction of digital switching ended the days of $10 a minute long distance calls, but they continued to cost, 25 cents a minute, because as long as you were on the phone, you were using up part of a scarce resource. This all works fine for the phone company because phone calls make sense in this paradigm, but the internet does not mirror this traffic pattern. So it is a terrible fit, and it was even worse when it was new. In 1995, when the internet explosion really started in earnest, basically everybody used it transactionally. You didn't connect to the internet and pull down a continuous feed of data as we often do nowadays with streaming and whatnot. You dialed up, downloaded, say, some email, and then sat there reading that mail for 15 minutes. And if you were smart, you disconnected your modem once you downloaded your mail so you weren't paying minute rates to your ISP while doing nothing, but well, how many people were that on the ball? Probably not a lot. So in practice, a ton of people just left their modem idling, tying up the line while they read a bunch of crap that was already on their computer. And this is how things had been all the way back in the late 70s when home computer users first started getting online. It was still that way in the 80s, but when the web popped off in the mid-90s and everyone started getting online, the pattern still didn't change. Streaming was virtually non-existent, and the majority of people didn't download large files, so mostly you would just connect to a website, spend 3 to 15 seconds downloading a page, depending on whether it was full of GIFs or not, and then spend 10 minutes reading it while your modem ticked away minute rates with your ISP. Packet-switched networks fit this transactional traffic pattern really well, though. This is why you can, for instance, connect 50 people through one 100 megabit Ethernet cable, and as long as none of them are really heavy users who want to run torrents or whatever, they can all share it just fine because the cable is only in use at the exact nanosecond that someone is actively transmitting a packet. So when you connect to a website, well, back in 95, this really isn't true anymore. You send maybe 2 packets to request a page, and then you get maybe 5 or 6 packets back with the contents. Nowadays, it's like 50,000 packets, but anyway. At that point, you're done using the connection, and the resources you were taking up to access the website can be used by someone else until you're ready to access another website. And this can sort of be done on circuit-switched networks. The problem, though, is that it's incredibly inconvenient. We all know that dial-up modems took a really long time to connect, on the order of 20, 30 seconds. So while we could have designed our web browsers to dial up when we click a link, download just the page contents, then disconnect immediately until we click another link, it's probably obvious why we didn't. The latency would make the web basically unusable. Nobody would have put up with it. So instead, you dialed up, then just left the motor running until you were ready to actually walk away from the computer or at least consciously choose to log off for the day. Yeah, remember when we logged off? Yeah, me either. The massive imbalance between how long you needed to be connected and how long you usually were resulted in literally catastrophic overutilization of the phone network, particularly in metropolitan regions, very tech-heavy ones like the California Bay Area. The telcos began to see surges of traffic that they'd never seen before. The average real phone call where you talked to someone was like 3 minutes long. The average internet call Well, I couldn't actually find good estimates, and as a matter of law, the telcos didn't have good estimates either, but I'd guess it was over half an hour, and this was a real problem because it was rendering the actual phone network unusable. The phone system, like all networks, is oversubscribed. This is the act of offering many customers a service while knowing that you can't actually deliver that service to everyone at once. Think of like a bus line, all right? A bus line would never actually promise to transport an entire city to anywhere they want to go at any time. If the whole population tried to board at once, no bus service in existence, even in Europe, could handle it. Instead, the bus line, and indeed all services, has a design capacity based on statistics. How many people need to bus to work at 9 a.m.? How many go at 10? How many walk or bike or take a train or, God forbid, drive? Not everyone is busing, and certainly not at all times, so by designing around those realities, you avoid choking the roads with buses that would mostly be empty at any given moment. So, how many people need to make calls at any given moment, and how long do those calls usually last? Would you believe the phone company knows those answers? They started tracking them in 1878, and by 1909, so much thought had been put into it that a Dane named Agner Erlang had invented a whole school of math around it called traffic engineering. The term Erlang is now used for a standard unit of traffic in network architecture and planning, and it helps predict, given how many subscribers you have and what their habits are, how much capacity you actually need to build. In other words, say there's 500 people in a town. When Bell builds an office there, they only put in enough capacity for, well, it would probably be like 50 or maybe 80 calls at once, but let's just say it was 100, okay? The office would thus be oversubscribed at a 5-to-1 ratio. After 100 people are on the phone, nobody else can make calls out. But in practice, the math usually works out and nobody notices until a sports team wins or a bridge collapses and everyone suddenly needs to make a totally unnecessary call at the exact same time. And I'll say again that all networks are built this way because they have to be. It's just how it works. If your ISP promises you gigabit internet, you might be able to get that speed, but only if the 50 other subscribers on your node don't choose to do so at the same time, because your circuits are probably being backhauled over a single 40 gig or even 10 gig link. The ISP didn't bring out 50 gigabits worth of bandwidth to your node because when they built it, they didn't even know if they'd get one subscriber in your neighborhood. Now it's too late to upgrade, so technically you're being sold bandwidth they can't deliver. The difference is basically that in a packet-switched network, the time sharing of a common resource, like an Ethernet cable, happens very quickly. Sending a packet is like making a phone call, but one that only lasts 10 nanoseconds. Then the line is free again for someone else to make a call. So if your traffic isn't absolutely continuous, the problem gets mitigated. And the closer you and your neighbors get to a transactional pattern, the better your collective experience will be. Put differently, you can honestly sell 50 gigabits while only delivering 10 because in real world conditions, everyone will probably get what they paid for. Unless everyone in your neighborhood actually does start torrenting Linux ISOs all day long. Not just the occasional nerd, but every single subscriber on a given node. If they all start downloading at full speed all day long, you're not going to get what you paid for, and this is the nightmare that keeps network architects up at night. Fortunately, this never happens, except in 1996, when it did. Something us youngins mostly never experienced is the phenomenon of waiting for dial tone. You see this printed on phones old enough to have dials, but I mean, what does it mean? The tone is just there. Like, what are we waiting for? Okay, well, those labels go back to the early 20th century at a time when the network was far more oversubscribed than it was in later decades. Prior to the digitization of the phone network, switching gear was gigantic and unfathomably expensive, so even really big offices were severely limited in capacity. This was reflected in some strange ways. During most of the 20th century, when you dialed a phone, your digits were received by a piece of gear at the CO. It had various names, but at one point, this was called an originating register. This was a great big machine that was responsible for providing dial tone, collecting dial digits, validating them, and then handing them off to the rest of the system to complete your call. Now, ORs were very expensive, and COs had limited rooms, so in a tiny community with a couple hundred users, maybe only 5 people could be placing a new call at any given moment. But that's only for new calls. Once you finish dialing, your call gets handed off to a switch to complete the call. The OR drops out, resets itself, and becomes available again for the next caller. So if all the ORs were busy when you picked up your phone, you might get dead air. But it only takes a few seconds for one of the other users to finish dialing, so if you wait a few moments, you should get dial tone. Now, this phenomenon largely disappeared with the digital switchover. Because of miniaturization of computers, every single subscriber got their own tone generator, their own originating register, and so on. The system still had limits, but they were vastly higher. And yet, according to stories I've read, in parts of Silicon Valley in 1996, it was actually common to have to wait for dial tone, anywhere from 20 seconds to a couple minutes, ostensibly because so many people were online that the telcos were simply running out of capacity on their switching fabric. I don't have verification of the exact cause, but I've seen multiple claims that this happened for a bit, and I'm sure it did, at least briefly. The telcos probably just upgraded their gear to alleviate it, but even that was just kicking the can down the street. The fact is, it was never going to be possible for everyone to be on the internet all the time using a circuit-switched system, nor does it make sense. What your ISP and the various networks comprising the internet do today is to cram literally billions of users into a tiny handful of shared pipes, orders of magnitude fewer in quantity than the people using them, and that works because packet switching allows the network to be utilized only when people actually need it. So during everyone's distributed idle time, you're putting no pressure on those shared links, so everyone's traffic can dovetail together for maximum efficiency. The phone network could never deliver that, so the days of dial-up were numbered before they even began. Numbered, right? Because numbered before they even began, but even in the short window where dial-up was dominant, a number of very strange things managed to occur, and even after we replaced it with broadband, strange things continued. We'll do the second story first. Broadband was first introduced to the consumer public by ISDN. We're back on that again. The reason ISDN existed in the first place is largely because the telcos saw that the future involved a lot of computers, and that probably the average consumer would someday own one, and that probably most of them would eventually want to connect to someone else's computer. They figured this would happen a lot, actually, so everyone was going to want a digital data service. They got all of that right shockingly early, but they got a couple details wrong. First was the belief that said service would be point-to-point, as it was in those days. Bell saw people dialing up with modems and said, hey, what if we just made that faster and less janky? It was a good idea, but it wasn't good enough. As we eventually found out, circuit switching just doesn't make sense for what people actually wanted to do. In Bell's vision of the future, every time you clicked a link on a website, I mean, they probably didn't imagine hypertext yet. Barely anybody had that. Douglas Engelbart had. But, well, anyway, if they knew about the web, right, their version of it would be that every time you clicked a link on a website, you'd rapidly establish a phone call to the server owner, transfer some data, then hang up again. And in a sense, this is how the internet works now, but over the phone network, it would have been incredibly slow and clunky. The other thing they got wrong, though, was when this explosion would happen. They thought it would be in the 80s, but it really couldn't have happened before it did. 1995 was the right time for online access to pop off due to increasing computer speeds, collapsing prices, the availability of graphical environments, and many other things, but Bell didn't know that. And it's moot anyway because they failed to actually get it to market until the 90s. So the system they designed, while brilliant by the standards of early to mid-80s computing, was totally inappropriate to people's actual needs and laughably outdated by the time anyone could actually get it. As a data service, ISDN lines, BRIs that is, the ones you get at your house for $39.95, delivered 64 kilobits per second per channel, which is faster than 56K, marginally, but that is a big improvement because you'd get it all day long. It was guaranteed. 56K was notorious for never linking up at the full speed. So you always got 64K minimum, and since every BRI provided 2 channels, you could bond those to get 128K. That is more than twice as fast as dial-up, and you could have it in 1991, long before 56K even existed. But all that assumes that anyone would actually deliver it to you. By all reports, getting ISDN was like pulling teeth. The telcos clearly didn't want to provide the service for whatever reason. They had very few people staffing their ISDN teams. Most of their techs and salespeople didn't even know what it was. And Usenet is rife with stories of missed install dates, dozens of voicemails left without responses, salespeople going, I don't know what that is. It was a mess. Some people spent months trying to get it installed, because with no other form of broadband in existence, this was the only option if you wanted something faster than 33.6 kilobits. The failure of ISDN as a broadband service is something I'll touch on more in later videos, but the important thing is it did fail. Not only because it was hard to get and complicated to operate, but also because it was only 128 kilobits. Yeah, that is much faster than 56K, granted, but it's still dog slow by any kind of 10,000 foot viewpoint. Remember that people were running 10 megabit Ethernet LANs in 1988. That was the standard by which computer networking was judged going into the 90s. And as for internet connectivity, corporations were getting uplinks over T1s, which delivered 1.5 megabits. And I mean, sure, these things were expensive and impractical at scale at the time. All the experts and most amateurs understood that they couldn't have a 10 megabit uplink in 1992, but everyone remotely savvy saw where the wind was blowing and knew that it would eventually be possible. It was obvious that the future of the internet would involve much faster connections, which ISDN couldn't deliver, ever. Due to its very tight coupling to the internal workings of the phone network, that 128 kilobits was a permanent limitation that could never be expanded on. So when I say that ISDN was never state-of-the-art, I mean it. Even when it was introduced, it looked outdated to experts, and before most people had any reason to want it, rapid progress was already being made on its successor, ADSL. ADSL was invented by AT&T, but as deployed, it was largely not used by them as much as by others, in which role it was basically a parasite, a brain slug whose reason for existence was to abuse the provisions of the Telecom Act of 1996 in order to take advantage of phone company resources without giving them a penny in return. It works like this. When you order a phone line, you get a pair of copper wires that carry a voltage to and from the telco central office. The phone that you plug into that line has filtering circuitry in it, and the hardware at the CO end also has filters to ensure that when you pick up the phone and speak into it, no more than 4 kilohertz worth of signal appears at the other end. Now, that's an incredibly narrow band. The worst pair of wires in the world can carry signals far in excess of that, and if the telcos wanted to, they could have given us all HD voice on our home phones back in the 80s. It just would have cost them a bunch of money and nobody would have cared. However, it's possible to put 2 different signals on a wire at once, as long as there's some space between them. There's plenty of space above 4 kilohertz, so ADSL used it, and a lot more. When you get a DSL line, you plug in your modem in parallel with your phone, and it imposes a high-frequency signal on the line, somewhere north of 24 kilohertz and well up into the megahertz. Your ears can't make this out, so you don't know it's there, but hardware at the CO can recognize it easily. So, at the central office, the telco has a switch that provides your actual phone service. Out of that switch comes a wire with your dial tone on it, and that wire then goes in to a DSLAM, or DSL Access Multiplexer, which imposes the high-frequency broadband signal on top of whatever voice might be there. Then the combined signal exits, travels out into the world, and eventually connects to your house, your phone, and your modem, which each take what they want from it. Now, the important thing about this arrangement is that the DSL side has nothing to do with telephony at all. As soon as the DSL signal reaches the CO, it's stripped off. It goes into the DSLAM, and then it backs up onto an IP, or let's be real, ATM pipe that immediately leaves the phone company. Literally, the hardware that actually does the heavy lifting of getting your traffic onto the internet usually isn't in the CO. It's a bunch of ordinary computer networking hardware from Cisco or whoever in a conventional internet data center somewhere else. The only connection to the phone company is a fiber line going over to the DSLAM. And this is possible because ADSL doesn't care that your phone line is a phone line. I mean, it's just a piece of wire as far as it's concerned. ADSL is an animal. It's caveman technology. All it does is look for something conductive and then try to shove as much frequency into it as it can. If the conductor is crap, then it finds very few usable channels and you end up with 768K service. If the conductor is nice, clean copper and only 1,000 feet long, it finds lots of workable channels and you get 40 megabit service. You can, and this has been tested successfully in the real world, nail up an ADSL connection over a wet piece of string and still get 3 megs. The reason ADSL is typically used on phone lines is just because they're already strung up between your house and a convenient air-conditioned building that anyone can access for a fee. And on that point, let's talk about co-location. Implementing the Telecom Act of 1996 was an unholy process. The terms of the act were in some places simplistic and subject to interpretation, but what it came down to is that if you were going to be a competitive carrier, you needed access to the existing phone lines. But that's all you got. You didn't get to rent time on the existing phone company switches because what would be the point? You'd literally just be reselling service. That can't be real competition, and for once, American capitalism recognized this. So, as a new phone company, also known as a competitive local exchange carrier, or CLEC, you had to be able to plug a subscriber's wires into your own switchgear, and that meant that the regional Bell company whose lines you were using, also known as an incumbent local exchange carrier, or ILEC, had to give you space in their central office to install your equipment. This sounds much simpler on paper than it actually is. The ILEC couldn't let any of the CLECs touch their equipment because they could disrupt service by accident or on purpose, and the ILEC would be liable for it. The CLECs also couldn't be allowed to touch each other's equipment for the same reason, so central offices became little prison blocks, divided up by fences into tiny cells called cages, each one the sovereign territory of a LEC. The local Bell can't enter your cage without your permission, and you cannot touch their wires or gear without theirs. If you want to sign up a new subscriber, you have to put in an order with the ILEC to bring their wire to a cross-connect panel that goes into your cage, but they don't go inside. They tie to the outside, and then you go inside and make another connection to your equipment. It's all tightly regimented, nobody trusts anyone, and so they had to massively retrofit the COs to make it all possible. You won't be surprised to learn that this happened slowly, or not at all in many places, either because the ILECs drug their feet, not wanting to help their competitors compete on their own dime, or simply because the COs were in such poor condition that it was impossible. A lot of complaints and lawsuits flew around about this, but that's another story. Let's go back to ISPs. In the dial-up era, internet providers had nothing to do with the central offices. They were just ordinary telephone subscribers. They got T1s or PRIs or analog lines and brought them out to their data centers or wooden shacks and plugged them into their modem banks. DSL ISPs were a different story. They had to put their gear in the CO to strip out the high-frequency signal before it reached the telco switch, so they became a weird entity of their own. I've never been quite clear on how this functioned. When I worked for a DSL provider, we ordered lines directly from the local ILECs, and we had hardware in their offices, but we weren't a CLEC in the conventional sense. We owned no telephone switchgear. We only had DSLAMs. So I'm sure there was some kind of adjustment to the act after DSL was invented to allow this relationship, but I haven't been able to dig it up. In any case, once DSL became available, everyone wanted to offer it because it was stupendously fast. And if you weren't there, you might not realize just what a leap it was. I was there, and let me tell you, it was mind-blowing. A little mental curveball I like to throw people once in a while is that 56K modems probably hit the market a lot later than you'd think. The standard V.90 didn't come out until 1998. It really feels like it should have been 96 at the latest, but it wasn't. On the day Unreal came out, the fastest modem you could generally buy was 33.6 kilobits. Let's not talk about K56 and X2, thank you very much. So that's the first half of the curveball, but here's the follow-through. Pacific Bell, that's the RBOC for much of Northern California, began offering ADSL service as a trial in 1997, then formalized it as a product in 98. Now, let me just preempt this. Yes, I know people live outside of California, okay? I'm very aware of the slow spread of broadband, especially in rural areas and nations not the US. In fact, I found out a couple nights ago from a patron in New Zealand that for much of the 2000s, the fastest service anyone could get there was 256 kilobit DSL. But the point I am making is that there are a significant number of people here for which 56K was not relevant for even a second. Some folks went straight from 33.6 to ADSL in 97, while others, like myself, made the hop in 98. So while I do remember using dial-up, it was 33.6. I think I only managed to connect at 56K like once or twice before we upgraded, and I never needed to do it again. And man, what an upgrade. While DSL speeds are highly variable, Pac-Bell's was tip-top. We got 1.5 megabits down and about 768K up. That's full business T1 speeds in one direction and about 6 ISDN BRIs in the other. So something like $700 of conventional telco data service for $59.95 a month. And the experience was, I can't even describe it. I had heard legends of T1s, but I never thought I would have one. And I mean, My birthday present in 1997 was permission to tie up the phone line to download the Quake demo, and the 9 megabyte file took 40 minutes. On this new connection, it took 45 seconds. This is what finished burying ISDN. There were plenty of Usenet posts in 1998 popping off about this. Why are the prices so unfair? Why is DSL cheaper than ISDN for 10 times the speed? And nobody had a great answer, but I do in the fullness of time. ADSL was cheaper because it was far more efficient. Since it avoided the circuit-switched phone network entirely, they didn't have to pay the fees, both fixed and minute-based, associated with tying up its limited resources. Instead, DSL traffic hopped straight over to the packet-switched internet, which was so much more efficient for computer networking that the comparative costs, byte for byte, made the phone network look like a satellite uplink. The phone companies did not love this situation. The lines were probably the least profitable part of their entire enterprise. Basically, they buried them at immense cost so that when they tried to attract customers to use their network, nobody would say, hey, that sounds great, but I don't want to pay $2,000 for trenching or wait 3 months while you do it. Now, however, these ISPs were showing up and buying hundreds, thousands of lines to provide DSL and then just scramming with the profits, not even connecting back to the ILEX to transit phone calls. This was infuriating, but there wasn't much they could do about it, at least nothing direct. We're finally coming back to Jim's comment about dry pairs, by the way, so you can wake up your napping girlfriend now. When DSL started out, it was always sold in a line share config. That's what I described earlier. You get dial tone for voice calls and an ADSL signal all over one line. And at first, both were provided by the ILEC. And this was very convenient because the ILEC was now selling 2 services on 1 pair of wires, thus recovering a lot more from their physical investment. But when CLEX started selling DSL, they found customers who didn't want phone service. They just wanted the internet. So they looked at the rate decks and said, hey, these dry pair things sound pretty good. A dry pair is, well, it's really just another term for a phone line. It's still 2 wires going from the CO to a customer's house. The difference is it doesn't have any service on it from the phone company. No dial tone, no voltage to power your phone, nothing. I think these are what got used for the leased line services that I brought up earlier, though I might be wrong. I know, however, they were used for things like fire alarm uplinks, stuff that never needed to make a phone call, just send a very basic signal. Now, since dry pairs get less service and don't touch the rest of the phone system, they're cheaper than full phone lines. So if you don't need dial tone, they seem like a perfect fit for delivering DSL. But again, think about how the ILEC would see this. When the DSL was being sold on top of phone service, they were usually getting a cut based on usage, even if the phone service was from somebody else. But here, they were getting nothing more than the regulatory minimum fee for co-location and a leased line. So if Jim Logan from Usenet is to be believed, once the ILECs noticed that all these ISPs were ordering tons of dry pairs, they decided to bump up the price. Now, as I noted earlier, FCC and state regulations make discriminatory pricing illegal, but probably dry pairs weren't a massive part of their business, and probably the vast majority at this point were being bought by ISPs anyway. So the Lex could increase the price for everyone. It probably would scare off that many legitimate customers since most of them had no choice, and the bulk of the burn would be felt by the ISPs. Now, I proffer this theory because they had a big, loud, messy track record of squabbles over things just like this. So it's time to talk about reciprocal compensation. Yeah, baby, it's party time. Let's go back to, once again, the Telecom Act of 1996 and focus on a very interesting problem that it created and then more or less solved. Here's something that, if my sources are correct, will shock the Europeans in the audience. Local landline phone calls in the US are, and I think have always been, free. If you're calling your friend 3 blocks down the street, you don't pay for that per minute. Cell phones are a different matter. We won't discuss them. But if you have a copper line from the local Baby Bell, you can yak with your girlfriend across town all day and night and never pay a dime. Although if you did it from a payphone, you did used to pay a dime. Later on, it was a quarter. Apparently, though, this was never true outside of the US, and I actually saw a guy on Usenet get dunked on for it. Some German dude was boasting about, I went and ordered ISDN, they hooked it up next day, and someone was like, that's cool, man. How about your unlimited local calling? When are they going to hook that up? Or your DSL? And I think he won because the German guy never showed up again, so I think he got owned. Anyway, the reason local calls are free, I assume, is because the phone company wants you to use the phone. Charging you for every minute of usage discourages use. They want you to live and breathe and think phone day and night. And since most people only need to make local calls, and since the telcos were already charging a pretty hefty price just to give you a phone line at all, it made sense to bundle in free local calling. Since most customers use the phone rarely, they're effectively paying for a service that they're massively underusing, and that subsidizes their neighbors who burn up the line day and night. Then the telcos recover the rest of their maintenance costs and profits by charging slightly higher fees for long distance. Whole thing works out, perfect ball in space, etc. At least until we stop having a telco monopoly, which we did in 1984 and did even harder in 96. Okay, so picture this. You're a new upstart phone company in New York. You put your switch in Verizon CO and hook up a handful of subscribers who, it just so happens, are all pizzerias. Your pizza till. A month later, you check your records and discover something really disturbing. Verizon has been burning up your interconnect all month long, sending you thousands of calls, and you haven't seen a penny of revenue. What gives? Well, it turns out that, weird thing, pizzerias don't place a lot of outbound calls. You ever think about this? Other than phoning up suppliers, who do they have to call? And when they do call someone, it's always local. They're calling the local produce delivery place, right? So they're never paying anything for the few outbound calls they make, and the overwhelming majority are inbound from customers calling to order pizza. In 1980, this wasn't a big problem. Every call in New York was from and to a Verizon well, it would have been Bell Atlantic back then, right? Well, anyway, it was from and to a subscriber of the same phone company, and they were all paying their $40 a month, so they had no need to charge anything on top of that. But now, as Pizzatel, you look at your records, and what you see is Verizon, it's Verizon now, we're talking like 97, 98, so they're Verizon now. They're burning up your network, they're driving thousands of calls through your switch, but you aren't seeing a penny from any of it because in telephones, the caller always pays. If there's a fee for a call, it is always on the side of the person who dialed the number. Think about it. If somebody called you from 2,000 miles away and it was like a $2 a minute call, you don't need to worry about that. They're the only ones who have to worry about that. Pizzatel's customers aren't paying anything for all those inbound calls because that's just not how it works. So Verizon's calls are choking out your hardware. You're throwing busy signals, but you can't afford an upgrade because you're on a fixed income. You don't make more money when your subscriber's service gets more popular. You just get the set monthly amount from this tiny subscriber base, nothing more. So when your system starts throwing busy signals, you won't be able to fix it. And naturally, your customers will all jump ship, probably to Verizon. This is intolerable and it does not foster competition, but it's okay because Congress already provided for this in the Act. When an ILEC sends a call to a CLEC, they always pay for the service. There's a fixed permanent rate. It's very low. It's something like half a penny a minute. And this is called reciprocal compensation. It ensures that the ILECs, as incumbents who've had a century to attract subscribers, aren't able to use their massive bulk to crush CLECs under a waterfall of unprofitable traffic. And for a couple years, this worked. Then the internet came and everything went to hell. But we knew that. The traffic pattern of a dial-up internet service provider closely resembles that of a pizzeria. Well, the most popular pizzeria in the world times a million, and every order requires an hour-long negotiation. Calls to ISPs were all inbound and all very, very long, and this was a traffic pattern nobody had ever anticipated. So the effects were subtle and insidious. It only took about a year for things to come to a head. Sometime in 97, ILECs started refusing to pay reciprocals to CLECs for internet traffic. This is a direct violation of the law, so how did they justify it? Well, let's back up and take a look at the big picture. When dial-up ISPs signed up for phone service with ILECs, they paid for, let's say, T1 and PRI trunks with hundreds or thousands of channels, and the ILECs profited tremendously off of this in exchange for tying up loads of their network and switching resources to connect all those calls. Now, the question of whether trunk sales could actually have paid for the network upgrades to make mass dial-up service feasible is one I can't answer, but it's also moot because it didn't happen. Instead, all the dial-up ISPs signed up with CLECs. Now, why was that? Well, it's because of another unintended consequence of the Telecom Act of 96. Buried in an FCC decision years into the ensuing mess, I learned a very interesting tidbit. I said earlier that the baby bells were required to publish all their prices and to charge every customer the same amount. The CLECs were not. They had no constraints. I mean, the purpose of the act, after all, was to encourage competition, which capitalism sees as only one thing, making prices go down. Fixing CLEC pricing would thus be counterproductive, so they didn't do it at all. A startup phone company could charge any amount they wanted, give customers special pricing, and refuse to do service with whomever they chose. So, you remember the prices I quoted earlier for PRIs, like $500 a month or higher? Is that the actual cost of delivering a PRI circuit? Hell no. I mean, with a handful of subscribers, the hardware costs can get paid off in a pretty short time frame. So if you're paying $500 or $1,000 for service, that money is being chopped up and billed to 10 different internal departments. Some is going to outside line maintenance, some goes to switchgear, some pays technician wages, some pays rent on buildings. The cost of the service is not just the hardware, but the whole company and network. Well, now imagine if you were a startup phone company who didn't have any outside lines, any maintenance costs, any technicians, any buildings to rent, nothing more than one moderately sized telephone switch. Well, your costs would obviously be pretty damn low compared to a real phone company, and you could offer very cheap service to your subscribers, but I mean, how could you operate that way? Who would sign up with you? Well, how about a company whose entire operation consists of 10 racks of modem banks sitting in a data center? Some clever fellow figured out pretty early on that you could sign yourself up as a CLEC, buy a telco switch and install it, then just run a bunch of PRIs, which the ILEC was responsible for maintaining on their own dime, over to an ISP's data center and make that your only customer. No home users, no pizzerias, just one quiet, happy subscriber who gets calls all day long. Now, how would you attract this perfect customer? Very simple. You offer them service for free. Dead ass, no charge for 5 or 10 PRIs. Now, how can this work? It's very simple. The ISP is not the customer. They're the bait for a scam. The scam is called traffic pumping, and if you worked in an office in the 2000s, there's a good chance you've taken the bait before. You ever hear of those free conference call services? They're these phone numbers you just call up, you put in a code of your own choosing, and bam, you're in a conference call. You can have your work buddies, your customers call in, you can all chat. Don't worry about a thing, it's all 100% free. It's weird, right? You don't get any ads played in your ear or anything. It's obviously a scam, but what's the scam? Who's paying for it? Well, the answer is your phone provider. That conference call is hosted on a crappy asterisk PBX laying on its side in a telco CO plugged into a phone switch, and it's the only thing that's hooked up. The CLEC that owns that switch has no subscribers except themselves. By publishing these numbers, they get you and your customers to call in, and the whole time you're connected, every minute, your phone providers pay them another delicious mouthful of reciprocal compensation kibble. Once again, let me just repeat, if you're not paying for something, you aren't the customer. You're the grease lubricating the gears of a scam. You can't imagine how many times I had to explain this to customers at my job. Yes, sir, I know you're having audio issues when you call those conference services. That's because none of them are configured correctly because they're run by criminals. Except, well, that's the thing. They aren't criminals. Unlike several other phone scams, such as slamming and cramming, traffic pumping is completely legal. The telcos hate it, but it's so hard to construe what's actually wrong with it that their repeated attempts to ban the practice have themselves been declared unlawful. After all the calls are being placed by people who want to place them, and there's nothing statutorily wrong with free conference call services, nor are they even necessarily wrong on their face. You can just look at it as a legitimate business with an unusual billing scheme. I mean, is it legitimate to run a conference bridge service that people pay a minute fee to use? Yes, obviously it is. Well, everyone calling you is paying their phone carrier, and that's where the reciprocal compensation money comes from, so who are you robbing here? The caller pays the telco pays you. The money pays to run a service. Where's the crime? Well, you and I can look at it and go, the crime is an ethical one. It's in the fact that they don't care if their conference service is good or even works. But, I mean, have you used WebEx or Teams? In short, these ISP-centric CLECs were all running tight little operations. They'd figured out that since ISPs never place outbound calls, they'd never have to pay a penny to any other company. And since ISPs get loads of inbounds, which all last for incredibly long times, they could rake in the dough from the reciprocity clause. Which, of course, was possible simply because Congress, the FCC, and the Bells had never anticipated this kind of scheme. I mean, how could they? But this brings us to the disputes of 97 and 98. The ILECs saw what was going on. I mean, it was hard to miss, really, since they were suddenly billing an immense amount of money to the CLECs, and it also wasn't too hard to figure out where the calls were going. To give you an idea, the FCC at one point made 3 official observations. First, CLECs on average received 18 times more calls than they sent. The outliers had a 40-to-1 ratio. Second, the total amount of money that changed hands via the reciprocal compensation rule was $2 billion a year. And finally, 90% of those calls were to ISPs. So the ILEX decided that all these calls were not, for the purposes of law, phone calls, and stopped making reciprocal payments. This, of course, resulted in the companies all going to arbitration and culminated in the FCC making an absolutely fascinating decision. At some point, one of the ILEX made the assertion that these calls to the internet were not local calls. This requires some explanation. Whether a call is local is determined through a complicated rubric I won't get into. In short, if it seems like it isn't long distance, it probably isn't. And an important thing about ISPs is that they never want you to dial long distance if it can be avoided, because you'll pay absurd minute rates, making your service look more expensive, and those fees won't go to the ISP, only to your carrier or to a long distance provider. This discourages people from using the internet, so the ISPs try to avoid it by installing equipment in every major city so that nearly every user will have a local number they can dial for free. But if you did have to dial your ISP long distance, that would have an interesting effect. It would defeat reciprocal compensation. Because, you see, when you dial long distance, you do so through a dedicated long distance carrier who charges you a certain amount per minute. That charge is then split up. The long distance carrier keeps some of it, and the rest is sent back to the originating carriers. So there's no need for the ILEC to pay the CLEC anything because the long distance carrier will do it instead. The ILEC, in this case, made the argument that internet calls are actually long distance because the traffic almost inevitably ends up crossing state lines. There was a lot of debate over this point, but the FCC ended up agreeing that, generally speaking, no connection to the internet was likely to be exclusively local. And everyone watching is rolling their eyes because why does any of this matter? It's the internet. It has nothing to do with the telephone network. Once the call reaches the ISP, it hops off the phone line, a modem converts it into IP packets, and then it's disseminated into the fabric of the internet. It's not a long-distance call because it stops being a call. Well, the ILEX disagreed. They said that a connection to the internet was conceptually no different than a call that gets routed through an intermediate carrier on its way to a distant location. Sure, the call initially terminates at a local provider, but then it's coupled to a second call that travels the rest of the way, and that makes the entire call long distance for regulatory purposes. They said that the ISPs were doing this, making them long distance carriers. The fact they were not collecting premiums for the service was their choice and immaterial. And the FCC bought it. Hook, line, sinker, and in utterly transparent bad faith. If you read the FCC decision, and you should if you have a long night to waste, it's abundantly clear that the Commission did not care about long-distance calls. They did not see this as a telco issue. What they saw was the ILEC networks being destroyed by these 2-hour internet calls. And they saw a bunch of clever dicks starting up CLECs just to milk the fee recovery system, and they saw it only getting worse until it started to destroy the telephone network entirely. In one of their rulings, they asserted that if the ILECs weren't given some way to stop the bleed, they would simply jack up the prices of all landline phone service, because that's the only legal recourse they would have. They couldn't cut off the ISPs or charge them a different rate because that would be discriminatory, so the only option available would be to increase prices for all subscribers, which the FCC asserted would be tantamount to forcing everyone's grandmas to subsidize heavy internet users with their lifeline telephones, an unconscionable outcome they could not permit to happen. If you have any doubt that the FCC was simply lying when they agreed with this asinine theory, don't worry. They basically admitted it, because not long after they issued this decree, known as the Internet Traffic Order, it was overturned by an appeals court who said they'd failed to prove why internet-destined phone calls were interstate by definition, and in response they simply changed their argument and issued the decree again. The new one is known as the Order on Remand, and it's almost identical. While they did pretend to mea culpa, pretended to admit their logic had been faulty, and presented a new theory, which I can't even understand if I'm honest, they also asserted that they'd been right in the first place, and in not so many words, that the ends justified the means. Come on, guys, get it together. But they went further. They also asserted that the courts had no jurisdiction over them in this matter, and they presented a new ultimate solution to the whole mess. Instead of delivering no compensation, the ILECs would provide less. calls destined to ISPs would receive a special lower reciprocal compensation. Then after 3 years, it would drop even further from like a 1/10 of a cent per minute to a 17th, something like that. The purpose of this, they said, was to wean the CLECs off this revenue stream, and the FCC admitted that this wasn't a lot of money and that it might not make these calls profitable for ISP CLECs, but their proposed remedy was that the CLECs start actually charging their customers for service. This was a polite way of saying, we caught you, we know you're thieves, and even though we can't make it illegal, we are going to turn the screws, so go legit or go to hell. Oh, and if you're wondering how they determined who was an ISP CLEC for this purpose, they had no sophisticated method for detecting data signals or anything like that. They just declared that any CLEC receiving 3 times more calls than they placed was an ISP. If you were a legitimate phone company, you could get lumped in under this, and you had to go appeal it. Like they were out for blood here. And this landmark ruling was immediately challenged and rejected again by the courts, who said once again that the FCC had failed to prove their case and that their new logic was no better than the old. But curiously, the court chose not to overturn it. They simply said the FCC should find better reasoning and left it at that. The parties to this mess could have taken it further, but curiously, they didn't. Apparently, everyone just gave up, and to the best of my knowledge, this ruling is still in effect today. Maybe everyone realized they were, in an almost literal way, fighting City Hall. Or maybe they realized this was actually the best possible outcome. Legitimate CLECs weren't getting totally screwed and did have options for cost recovery, while the bastards had been, as the FCC put it, put on notice that it might be unwise to rely on the continued receipt of reciprocal compensation. So, if I haven't made it clear, this fascinates me, and it's because it was a gigantic, thunderous clash between some of the biggest and most powerful organizations in the nation at this point in time, and I've never heard of it. Although, I think I know why. It's probably because I got ADSL in 1998, before several of these fights even happened, so I stopped paying attention, and soon after, almost everyone else did too. And I know that the spread of broadband wasn't as fast as it should have been, and so this remained relevant to a lot more people than just Californians for a long time. But what I'm saying is that in the bigger picture of culture, what people were talking about and what was being reported on Slashdot and whatnot became broadband. People stopped talking about dial-up, so it's no shocker that I didn't hear about this. And I would guess that for the most part, this probably became irrelevant because as we went into the 2000s, dial-up really got sidelined as a major product. It was no longer really being marketed. It was just what you got if you couldn't get broadband. And I suspect it was almost entirely being provided by the same companies who were selling the broadband. So basically, if there were still any squabbles about how much it cost to provide, they probably just wrote it off as the cost of doing business. So its legal status after this point, I suspect, is largely moot. And as good as it might feel to end on that bombshell, I'd like to tell one more story, also about fraud and also from Usenet. Actually, it's the first thread my search the other night turned up. It's much shorter, much dumber, completely irrelevant, and much harder to believe, but it happened. I came across this post from a Justin Clark. Now, he's offering dial-up service in the Bay Area using PRIs served up by some CLECs, but since he's in the Bay, he expects a bunch of his customers to be the rare specimens with ISDN modems. Now, he's heard that calls on ISDN lines have an associated minute fee, even if they're local. What can be done about this? Well, the answer is a collective nothing, because it turns out what he's heard is true. PacBell ISDN lines are billed completely differently than normal phones. They get a pack of flat rate minutes, some during peak hours, some off peak, and then they pay 3 cents a minute after that, even for local calls. There's nothing Justin can do about it because if there was, it would be a violation of the state utilities regulations. The phone company priced the calls this way and they can't discriminate. So that's that, and that's final. And then Keith says offhand, well, unless you use Centrex. I'd guess about 8 people in the audience either rolled their eyes just now or sat bolt upright like, no, you can't do that. Don't even suggest that. Someone might try it. Bad news for you, buddy. They did. And now I have to explain it for the poor saps who haven't had their brains completely damaged yet. I have touched on the concept of PBXs in a few recent videos. A PBX is very simply a little phone company central office that lives at your business. or home if you're a big enough nerd. It provides basically all the same services as a telco CO, but only for you and more or less for free. You can buy a PBX, hook up 500 phones, and call between them all day and night without paying the phone company a dime because you own the whole thing. But there's a big problem with PBXs. You own the whole thing. A lot of people want the benefits, local extensions, voicemail, conference calling, maybe paging, but they don't want to feed and care for a PBX. That requires employing a PBX tech. And the math looks even worse if you have, say, a chain of small businesses all over a large city, each one with maybe 5 or 2 phones. Installing a PBX at every site, then tying them all together over a distance will be cost prohibitive if it's even possible. So, enter Centrex, the PBX that wasn't. When the phone companies started computerizing their systems, they realized that the unlimited complexity of software-driven routing allowed them to do clever new things, such as telling the system that a given phone line was not actually part of the greater phone network. Centrex was introduced in, I think, the late 60s, and it allowed a telco switch to be divided into, I don't know the term for sure. I'm going to call them slices, each one dedicated to a specific customer. You had the global slice that had just normal users in it, and then you'd have one slice per Centrex customer, and within each one of these, the usual rules didn't apply. Phone numbers could be any length you wanted, so you could have short extensions, and you could build hunt groups so that calls to a single public number would be delivered to one or many internal extensions in order or at once. Outbound calls could all have the same caller ID, many such features. Basically, if you know what a PBX is, it's that, except all the lines go back to the telco, all right? Well, Centrex continued to exist into the ISDN era, and for what should be obvious economic reasons, Bell chose not to charge that 3 cent per minute rate for extension-to-extension calls, also known as intercom calls. Like, half the point of having a PBX is that those are free. Nobody would pay for Centrex service if they had to pay to call the desk right next to them. But this is another marketing fiction because those calls were perfectly ordinary phone calls. They were still tying up resources on the central switch. The telcos just chose to eat the cost because, well, they were recovering it elsewhere in the larger charges for the overall Centrex service. So it should be apparent that if an ISP were to put all their customers onto a Centrex group, that would eliminate the minute rates. It's just a totally absurd solution. Are you kidding? It's like a grocery store saying they'll do local delivery, but only if you move into the apartments on top of their building. Who would make such a bizarre and restrictive, life-affecting decision just to get online a little bit cheaper? Yeah, it was a lot of people. Relatively speaking, were not just interested in this, but pursued it. I found many threads asking where to find ISPs that offered ISDN Centrex service, and they got answers. I was certain these guys were doing a bit, but they were dead serious. The only reason Justin didn't take them up on it is because he'd already tried, and his CLX wouldn't offer it. You'd think this would be some kind of illegal or against the rules, but again, in a deeply regulated system, unless something is explicitly disallowed, it has to be permitted. Otherwise, there's room for predatory business practices. So this was all legit. I found another thread talking about it where someone asked for an explanation. They got one. Then they got a lengthy screed from a Carl Denninger about how they would go to double hell and get billed for $20 million so they got caught and all this other crap. And then everyone else is just like, Carl, you're full of shit. The ISP just orders the line in their own name and has it installed at the customer site. That's legal. This is completely above board. By the way, I later found a post from the group admin asking people to please stop asking him to ban Carl, so that's how that went. In conclusion, no conclusion. I wrapped up with the story as a digestif. There's some kind of through line to all of it, but it's a vague one. It's mostly just, it's amazing how the Telecom Act affected everything. It's amazing that the internet happened at all. It's amazing that ISDN got fielded. It's amazing they punished everyone who tried to buy it. It's amazing that dial-up almost destroyed the telcos and that the replacement for it did far deeper damage than they ever could have imagined. And even more amazing that they were the ones who asked for all this data traffic in the first place, then said, whoa, not like that, when everyone took them up on it. It's just a whole unholy mess, and it's still going on to this day. DSL refuses to die, and when it does, the telcos are just pivoting into fiber anyway, and I'm sure all the same things will apply. The baby bells aren't going anywhere, so I'm sure the same wars are still being fought on the same regulatory battlegrounds. So the history of the phone company from 1996 and probably to forever will always be one of scams, counter scams, and counter scams. 1,000 clever dicks scratching at the surface of one piece of legislation and finding loopholes from both directions. In 20 years, I bet it'll still be going on. This video's done going on, though. I'm gonna peace out. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I didn't do my best to make it enjoyable, but frankly, I'm lucky I'm even sitting up right now. So if you liked this anyway, I'm glad to hear it. Consider subscribing if you haven't. Remember to turn on notifications if you want to see when I upload new things. But if you want to support the channel so I can keep making new things, consider hitting up my Patreon like these folks. While I used hardly any actual props in this video, the only reason I can talk intelligently about any of this is partly because I've been spending weeks working with relevant equipment, getting a grounding in how it all works that helps me get my head into the right space to read reams of FCC rulings. And I couldn't afford any of that equipment, or the space to experiment with it in, or the time to do the experiments and the research and whatnot without my supporters. So thank you all so much for believing in me. I couldn't do it without you. And everyone else, thanks for watching.